Surely Russia can.
Jonathan Rugman reporting there, and I'm joined in the studio by Raoul Ruparel, the chief economist for the think tank Open Europe, and from central London by Edward Lucas, the former Moscow bureau chief for The Economist. Thanks very much, both of you, for joining us. Raoul Ruparel first. President Putin amazingly bullish today. Keep calm, he says, didn't seem too troubled. Do you share his confidence?
Well, I don't entirely share his confidence, and I think there were some messages behind the scenes that were getting the country ready for a period of prolonged pain. The 2 years he mentioned that is going to be a very serious economic problem for Russia. I think as the oil price declines, there will be increased ruble volatility. He mentioned that he is not going to stem the fall of the ruble. He doesn't want to see the foreign reserves used for that, and he talked about other ways to use the reserves, including supporting companies and social intervention and supporting the poorer parts of the population. But I think there was a message behind saying this will be a difficult time, but he's still bullish, he's not going to change course, and I think that is what some parts of the Russian population respond to.
And he did say Russia will adapt to this situation. Easy for him to say, perhaps. How do you think the Russian people will be taking this?
Well, I think it is easy to say, but much harder to do. Russia's been talking about diversifying away from oil and gas for such a long time, but it's never really happened, and he's propagated the whole model. So it seemed a bit strange that he was so detached, saying the whole economy needs to reform, we need to diversify, and yet he has been involved in this for a very long time. So it's very difficult to institute that overnight, and it's going to be a very long-term process. And I think it's going to be very difficult because this whole model is instituted at a huge number of levels throughout the country.
Edward Lucas, the one question everyone in the West always asks is, when does this turn into a political crisis for Putin? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think it is a political crisis for Putin because, as you've just pointed out, the political mechanisms don't exist for putting him under real pressure. There's no real legislature, there's no real free media, there's no real civil society, the courts are under the control of the state. So he's really got all the levers of power in his hand. The one thing, of course, he can't control is the financial markets and the confidence that people have in the ruble and in Russian debt and so on. But I think he thinks he can tough this out. He thinks he's managed to spot the West's weakness. He's pushing ahead quite hard against the West. He doesn't really take the sanctions too seriously, and he also doesn't really have any other option. It's not as if he can say, oh yes, I've got it wrong over the last 15 years, let's try something different. That would be really devastating. So I think his only option really is full speed ahead, and that's what he's doing.
And he was quite clear today that how many of Russia's problems were being caused by the West. Is that helpful to him, that message? Does that bolster his position?
Well, it's both sort of untrue and really quite bonkers, because really Russia's problems are caused by the corruption and incompetence of the rulers, particularly one Mr. Vladimir Putin. But it certainly suits his narrative. It's the story he tells to the Russian people that this is all the West's fault, that the West has betrayed Russia, the West has encircled Russia, the West is trying to promote regime change in Russia. It's not actually true. What we're actually trying to do is to make sure that countries like Ukraine and the Baltic states and others have the same liberty and decency and legality and security that we take for granted here in Britain. And that's a noble aim, and it's unfortunate that Russia doesn't share it, but for him that's just unacceptable.
Is there a danger, though, that if he does become weaker at home, if the crisis continues financially and turns into a political crisis, that he actually becomes a bigger threat?
Well, I think you can certainly argue that a cornered and desperate Mr. Putin is not going to be a comfortable neighbour for the West, but that doesn't mean that we should give in to him, because a Putin who's triumphant and reckons he's bluffed us and outmanoeuvred us would be even more dangerous. I think we're in a very difficult position because we've got things wrong for so many years. We've allowed this regime to steal tens of billions of dollars and launder it in the West. We've allowed them to attack neighbours repeatedly and get away with it, and we now have to make the best of a very difficult position. It's going to be a very dangerous 2015, I'm afraid.
Raoul Ruparel, you mentioned the oil price there. That's critical for Putin and Russia. What happens if it continues to stay low?
Well, I think, he is planning for that, and we heard the Russian central bank make their forecast a few days ago, which is really what sparked the run on the ruble, and they're predicting possibly if it stays as low as it is, it could be a 5% contraction in the Russian economy next year. So it is a very serious problem, and the key issue is this balance. Russia has always run a big current account surplus boosted by its exports, which offsets a huge amount of capital flowing out of the economy. Now, that balance has been present for the past 5 years, but now that is fundamentally changing. The current account account surplus is going down because they're not going to get as much money from their exports, and more capital is flowing out of the economy. And that is going to create a real problem of lack of capital and lack of liquidity in the Russian economy. And when that crunch comes down, it's going to be very difficult to deal with. And Putin seems confident still that he has enough foreign exchange reserves to deal with it, but it's not sure he does.
Raoul Ruparel and Edward Lucas. Sorry, we have to end it there. Thank you so much for joining.